The one thing I always say to people, if you have met one autistic person, you have met one autistic person.
After meetings, I will come away and think, did I make eye contact? Oh my God, I didn't. When I was presenting, did I keep a monotone tone? And these are all the things that, like, if you're not autistic and you wouldn't think about. You'd walk away and make yourself a cup of tea and wouldn't worry about it.
One thing that I very much believe quite strongly in myself is taking a step back and letting people who present autism differently to me take the stage and making their voices heard, because I was that stereotype.
My special interest is goats. Yes, that's why I got the job.
Hello and welcome to this episode of the Purple Goat podcast. I am Luke, the designer at Purple Goat.
I'm Dana. I'm a junior strategist at Purple Goat, but I'm also a content creator and I'm also autistic, given the title of the podcast episode.
Hi, I am Ruby. I am an autistic content creator, but I also make content around other disabilities, like my lived experience, because I have a range of various wonderful things. But I'm also a disability theatre maker and a practitioner, so I work within the disabled community making theatre work inclusive, well, as inclusive as I possibly can.
So this episode is about lived experiences of autism. Everyone on the panel here has autism, and we thought that it would be a really good idea to use the podcast as a platform to bring together some different voices and to see what autism means to all three of us, and to look at our three different lived experiences and to discuss really some topics around all things to do with autism. So as Dana and Ruby have said, they're autistic. I am also autistic. I was quite fortunate in that I was diagnosed at an early age. And for me, having autism is something I've always been aware of growing up. And when it has come to navigating the world, it's something that, even though I knew it was something that I had, it was something that I didn't always quite understand in and of myself. And it's really taken me a lot of years, despite that, to really come to understand what autism means to me and the ways it interacts with my life. And it's something that I'm still learning all the time, actually. So I guess that's the best way I can overview my lived experience of autism in a nutshell.
My autism journey, I thought, was a lot simpler until I started looking back at my childhood and remembering things that I'd kind of forgotten and speaking to my mum. So I wasn't diagnosed until... This is where it gets confusing. It was my fourth year of university, so I was 22. However, if you look on my doctor's notes, it says that I was diagnosed at 20 because apparently they diagnosed me and didn't tell me for 2 years. I found out at age 22, but I had a very, I think, quite autistic childhood, which sounds like a really unusual phrase. I was diagnosed quite early with dyslexia. I was always called an anxious child. I was diagnosed with quite intense anxiety disorder, and we kind of knew that that was how I was. And I had teachers actually pull my mum aside and say, "Ruby's special," and use that language. And I think that was the thing that my mum was like, what a weird thing to say. And that put her off, like, going to look into it further, because the school was coming from a really odd place. Throughout my childhood, I was the weird one. I was the odd one out. I was pulled out of lessons to do one-to-one. I was really far behind. I was struggling with a lot. I think it was a surprise when I was diagnosed autistic, because I genuinely didn't realize that autism could look like how it presents in me, but it made complete sense because all of the things were there in childhood. So it was like a surprise, but also really not a surprise. And it was actually my housemates at university who had autistic family members and were like, "You are actually presenting really autistic, and I think you should go and research and maybe speak to a doctor about it." And that's how I got my diagnosis.
In a kind of similar way to Ruby, growing up, I was labelled as a special kid, or I should say a diamond. That's what my district called it. I was a diamond learner. Very proud of that. So it basically meant I was taken out of class in primary school and secondary school to finger paint and eat sandwiches, because they thought I would be bullied in the playground, so, which I was, to be fair, but that's kind of where I spent most of my time. And all through primary school and secondary school, I didn't really know, and I'm going to use this language because this is how I felt at the time. I didn't really know what was wrong with me, but I knew that they'd identified me as something different, and I knew I'd identified myself as something different. And then when I got to university, within my first week of university, I was diagnosed as dyslexic, and they reaffirmed my diagnosis of dyspraxia. And it actually turns out I was diagnosed with dyspraxia shortly after I had meningitis. Because I had a lot of developmental delays, had to learn to walk and eat and talk and all this kind of stuff. And it all kind of just got middled up in that. And then I kind of started on this like content journey. And during COVID, I think it was, I unfortunately developed OCD, which was quite crippling. It was through those therapy sessions that my therapist said to me, I think you're autistic. You've got OCD, but I think you're autistic as well. And I think this is why you're struggling with therapy, pretty much. Then I paid privately, and I was in a very fortunate position to do that because that is a privilege, and I got my assessment. And then from there it's kind of been a bit like Ruby, unpicking years of diamond learners, special ed, and lots of other random terms. We kind of know that autism is hereditary. So as soon as I got diagnosed, I looked at my parents and I was like, well, it's not my dad. And my mum was like, it's me. And I was like, it's you. So she's now got a diagnosis too. So that's kind of, and she's 50. I think diagnosis is really valid in understanding who you are. It's obviously a privilege, but that is kind of my journey in a nutshell. It's a bit of a wiggly path, but we get there.
So I think a good place to start with this discussion would be to talk about stereotypes around autism, because as we know, like all three of us are involved with creative industries. We see media representations of autism all the time. And I think all three of us can agree right off the bat that the way that the media presents autism is not really at all mirroring our lived experiences. For me personally, what I found interesting growing up as someone who was diagnosed from a young age was that I definitely corresponded to that traditional, like very stereotypical projection of what autism was said to be like. For instance, I did really like Thomas the Tank Engine, and I was really good at maths.
Yeah.
There's no way of going around it. I was. Even for me, like looking at those stereotypical projections, like even though there were very similar outward traits between me and the characters that we be presented, a lot of the traits that were being presented didn't quite match my own, or the way that people interacted with those particular characters I didn't think was right. And I was like, I wouldn't want people to interact with me that way at all. I definitely consider myself quite privileged and fortunate in a way, because I was that stereotypical projection of autism. I was diagnosed very early, and I had media and resources around me, and I didn't agree with it, but I could at least look at and go, oh, well, I relate to it on this superficial level. But now, as an autistic adult and having been involved with the disabled community now for so long, I can one thing that I very much believe quite strongly in myself is taking a step back and letting people who present autism differently to me take the stage and making their voices heard, because I was that stereotype. There are so many autistic people who have been left behind or who have been missed by diagnoses, schools, medical, everything. From the conversations I've had with both of you, you've both, tell me if I'm wrong with this, you both definitely didn't identify with those very traditional stereotypical models at all. So I guess in terms of what those stereotypes meant for you, like if you had, any thoughts on them back then, if you have any, thoughts on them right now, I think it'd be good to discuss those and how you interact with those.
I mean, we were speaking earlier because Dana and I both were researching autism at a higher education level with our degrees. And when you look at the representation reflected in the research, you start to understand why the media representation is what it is, because if the research is tailored towards one certain presentation, then of course society is going to get that same view because that's what they're being told. But there's also there's so many layers to understanding autism, and there's so much intersectionality. Obviously we are 3 white people, so our experience is going to be completely different for a whole load of different communities, and there are so many levels that are not being explored or talked about. Well, there is more now. There's a huge shift in research that's coming out now, but there's still a really large separation between the amount of research that has been done on this stereotypical autism. Typically, with young male assigned at birth people, and it's looking at these young boys with these really rigid types of traits and presentations and special interests. The research is now developing onto how that's presenting in different people, how the intersectionality is coming in, because that's really, really important. It's allowing people to finally understand themselves, because the thing that gets me, and this is related but unrelated, is I don't know if you guys get it a lot, but the whole autism is a trend thing on social media, where it feels sometimes like we're just trying to bridge the gap in what society has understood of autism and what autism can be. And like I said, I genuinely didn't know that autism could look like how it looks like in my body. Also, the thing of like, you know, communication disability, autistic people are bad at communicating. You don't know you're bad at communicating. I personally don't have the awareness, so I'll be like, smash that communication. I did really well in that conversation. My friends will be there like, oh my God, Ruby, shouldn't have said that thing. And I'm like, you don't realise something's like seen as bad or wrong if that's how you've been doing something your whole life. So I literally go around like, I'm actually really, really good at my communication. And then I'll say something, or like I will really struggle, and I'll have non-speaking episodes, and I'll go, maybe I need to unpack what that looks like. But I think that's it. Like, there's just not the research out there. It needs to be more prominent. And it's also, the research is coming from the same type of person as well. So I'd be really interested in a lot of more lived experience, but also intersectional lived experience, so that far more people can see themselves represented, because we have seen a huge amount specifically around Black autistic people being imprisoned for just exhibiting autistic traits, which we still need to fight against. But I've rambled. There's a lot that I think about, obviously, because this is my research and my work, so I could spend hours talking about this. But Dana,
well, I think to kind of back you up, there is a quote from it's a disabled practitioner in general called Michael Owen, and it's, if disabled left it to other people to talk about disability, we'd end up with distorted and inaccurate representations of our experience and inappropriate support supervisions. And I think when we're talking, just because me and Ruby are coming from kind of that research perspective, reflecting on my time as a master's student, there isn't enough autistic researchers, and there isn't enough of any neurodiversity or disability in those spaces. So of course there's going to be a fracture between society and then actually making changes. In terms of what you were talking about, Luke, about kind of traits, like one thing for me, I think that now looking back kind of screams, like it screams from the closet, is friendships. Like I don't mean that I struggled with them. I mean that I could only ever have one best friend. And I attached to people like unbelievably quick. They would be my whole world, and then it would be too intense, too much, and we would fall out, and I'd be riddled with anxiety. And like, you don't see that reflection, that kind of attachment aspect that can happen as an autistic trait. For me, with friendships, that is one where I see A, where I struggle the most, and B, where I see kind of exhibited in my childhood, teens, because a lot of the time in high school I was severely bullied by a best friend, and I thought she was my friend, and my mum kept saying, Dana, she's not your friend, like she's bullying you. And I'd be like, no mum, she touches my hair in like a nice way, she's my friend. And because I didn't understand those kind of social presentations or interactions happen, I would be like, this person's my friend. And obviously when you see an autistic representation in the media or on whatever it is, you can often be depicted as on an island on your own. So I never identified, because I was like, well, I love my friends,
that is such like a difficult thing for many autistic people, is the vulnerability to abuse, because we can't
identify it.
Always identify it. And when I say we, I'm mainly talking, like, I'm absolutely not talking for the whole autistic community, because everyone's presentations are completely differently. But personally, I can't identify it, which has left me vulnerable time and time again. And it's that thing of that difficulty with communication is not going to look the same in everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And so all three of us might struggle with communication, but because I speak the way I do, people don't register that my communication may be in my difficulty in understanding, my difficulty in understanding intention,
Yes.
which leaves me vulnerable, which is really difficult because there is a privilege to me being able to talk about my experience, but it does mean that I am often and have been victim to abuse because of that. And so it's a weird one.
I mean, I think in terms, like, because we're having an honest conversation about autism and it's a progressive agency and conversation, like when we're talking about the autistic community, obviously not speaking for everybody, but we do know there is a lot of safety issues in and around how people manipulate intentions and kind of it being a vulnerable part of our society that we do need to kind of, we have like a responsibility as a society to understand autistic people in it, if they're in your life, to understand how they work and what they need.
I mean, we are classed as vulnerable adults.
Yeah. Like
as autistic people, we are under the Safeguarding Act, protected as vulnerable adults, just as young people are. But people forget that, especially in the way that we present. People will forget that we are so vulnerable.
On a happier note, because you mentioned special interests as well, and I'm going to switch the narrative. So my special interest is goats. Yes, that's why I got the job.
Is that the only reason you got the job?
I did say it in my interview, actually, to Dom. I did say, did you know? He was like, any more questions? And I was like, did you know? I was like, it's not a question, it's a fact, Dom. Did you know goats have rectangular pupils? And he was like, no. And I was like, you should know that. And I was like, and I grew up with a goat farm with like 100 goats in the back garden. Yeah, one of them's called Gandalf. And my other, Luke will be happy in a minute, we both share a special interest of Lord of the Rings. So, do you guys want to share a bit? I'm going to give you the floor to share about your special interests.
Dana said, Lord of the Rings, definitely, something I'm very interested in. One of my main special interests is tabletop gaming. So I've done it since I was about 10. I've jumped around different games, back and forth. Currently it's Warhammer. I've been doing Warhammer for a few years. Even though I'd say the Warhammer's what I do, Games Workshop also produce a Middle-earth strategy game. And it takes me, and my friends play it, and it takes me every ounce of strength to not get into it because I know I will. And I just don't have the space for it because of the special interest of the Warhammer and the collecting. But it's funny. Like, I feel like for me, tabletop gaming has always given me a really safe space as an autistic person, which is why I've always kept with it. I've met a lot of amazing people through tabletop gaming who have supported me and accepted me, and it's always been a community where I felt accepted and a part of it. It's taught me a lot of great life skills as well. I'm very thankful to have met the people I've met through it, and it's something I don't think at this point I could really not do. So whatever form it ends up looking like in the future, who knows? But it's that community and that whole world is just, it means so much to me. What about you, Ruby?
Well.
So
we all know. People watching going, oh, did not know that. So my special interest is Disney. However, what I really like to do is look back at my first love and my first special interest, because this is what I think is hilarious. And it's because it was socially acceptable. It was not socially acceptable, but everyone was doing it at the time. So when I was younger, my special interest was very clearly Twilight.
Okay, but Bella, I've had this argument, haven't I? She's definitely autistic and she's definitely dyspraxic.
Yes, I know who Bella Swan is, but I don't think she's autistic.
Do you not?
No.
Oh,
I think she's just awkward.
No, I think
because
she's
here's my argument. Because autistic traits are about the intensity.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think she experiences it intensely enough that it's disabling her life in order to reach a
diagnosis level.
Autism diagnosis level.
Autistically coded.
Autistically coded.
I do think she's autistically coded.
I think she's just a bit odd. It's like, when people they'll go, she's weird. And it's like, yeah, it's autistically coded, but because they don't understand it enough, she's not autistic. And do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's the author hasn't gone, this character is autistic.
No, so then I'm like,
therefore, she's not.
Because you don't understand it enough. No. But I was so deep into it. Bed sheets, posters, board games. Like, I would only watch it all the time. T-shirts, bags. One time, I'm really sorry that I'm baiting out my mum here, but my mum like used to take me out of school because Kristen Stewart was filming near my house. So my mum used to take me out of school. We'd go and stand in the gates and we'd wait for her. And oh my God, my Facebook name was like Mrs. Ruby Patson. But because all the other kids were doing it, I was like, I'm just a little bit deeper. But they'd have like one bag. They'd be like, oh, I love Edward Cullen. And I would be like, I would cry in my bedroom being like, I will never love someone the way that I love Edward Cullen. And it was so, like, it consumed my world. Oh, it was everything. And I'm like, oh, yeah, no, that was clearly a special interest. And that was very autistic of me. But everyone was just like, it's just a little weird gal. But now, yes, it is Disney. And I think for me now, and I don't know how other people experience their special interest because I know how I experience mine. But for me, a special interest is something that can bring you such intense comfort, but also throw you into a meltdown.
Mm-hmm.
Because you're so overwhelmed with the feelings of it. And I used to work at an SEN school, and my one-to-one also had a Disney special interest, we were great. We watched Mickey Mouse Clubhouse all day. He also would have meltdowns with how much he loved it. So if he watched too much, he would get overwhelmed. And me in a Disney store will have a breakdown because those feelings are so intense. And I think that is sometimes it's the intense. I always talk about when I'm talking about autistic traits, because a lot of people relate to many experiences because we're humans, but it's about the intensity. Mm-hmm. And it's such an intense thing that sometimes I can't even describe how important that thing is.
That is something that I can very much relate to. I think for me, having a special interest really it's, as you say, the overwhelming joy that it brings to my life is amazing. And I remember actually there was a time, it was during COVID when I was in my final year at uni. I actually was coming away from a special interest and I didn't really have one to replace it.
Ooh. Oh, I've never had that.
That was a very strange time for me.
Whoa.
In all honesty. It was like I didn't have a special interest and my world kind of just became very flat.
Oh.
It was so like different to how anything I'd ever felt before. I have hobbies, but I don't call them special interest.
Yeah.
And it was at that time where I was coming out of one game and I was moving into the Warhammer, but it wasn't a special interest yet.
No.
I wasn't there yet, and I knew I wasn't there yet. It was just a hobby, so I was doing it sometimes, but not a lot. I think the only other thing I had in my life at that point was like a game that I just used to play, a Switch game that I used to just play on repeat. And I clocked in over like 500 hours on it, even though it was the same storyline again and again.
That could be a hyperfixation.
I think it was
short term.
Yeah, it was very like
Yeah.
when I look back at that time versus like how I feel now that I've got a special interest back in my life, it's kind of highlighted to me how important they are.
Yeah.
And having one in your life, like as an autistic person.
It's one of the main autistic traits. Not all autistic people have a special interest. It's really important to point out. But it is a huge part of, for me, an autistic identity.
I mean, I'd love us to define the difference between, because I've done a couple of social media posts about special interests, and I will get, particularly non-disabled people actually, in the comments telling me that, oh, so it's just a hobby then. And I would love for us to try and kind of define what that actually means. And I think you did before about those big feelings. And also, I think normalizing to have multiple. Like, I definitely have 3. There's around 3. And anything to do with it. Like, if you stood me in a field of goats, I would have those really big feelings.
I'm going to do that.
I mean, you want to see it. But yeah, they love me. Goats love me. They know. I think you said it really well, Ruby, about it's almost so big. It's not just joy. It's like, but you also can't necessarily identify the emotion either.
It's overwhelming.
Yeah. But then equally, I don't want to step away from the goats. Do you know what I mean?
I think quite a easy example is me in Disneyland. I will have to go and take naps throughout the day because I'm feeling so many intense feelings all the time that I'll have to go and nap. But then I'll feel so sad that I'm napping and missing out being in Disneyland. But if I keep going, then it will trigger a meltdown because I'm feeling things so intensely. And you're like, but that's your happy place. But it's like, if I drank loads and loads of Diet Coke that gets to a point where I'm like, I can't drink Diet Coke anymore. In a day, and then I'm back the next morning. It's all right, guys. It's the intensity.
Yeah.
It's the intensity of it. It is all consuming.
Mm-hmm.
Your Disney example reminded me of an example that I have actually with the tabletop gaming. And there's one thing that I do with my mates sometimes is we'll go to Warhammer World and do a tournament at Warhammer World, because it's in Nottingham, so it's actually not too bad for me to get to. But the thing is those tournaments are so draining because each round is about nearly 3 hours long of constant communication, maths, moving stuff and all of that. And by the end of day 2, it's like 5:30 on a Sunday, and it's like you've just gotten through round 5.
Oh my God.
And you're so tired, but it's like, I have to keep doing this because I'm playing so many games in a row and I love it.
Yeah.
But I just can't not, like, and then we'll get in the car and we'll start going back, and then I'll just have a major headache on the way home, which part of it will be because I've been concentrating so much. I think the other part of it as well is I might have had like a stressful week. I'll leave all of that behind me, go do this completely different thing, be so consumed in it for 2 days, and then I'll just get out of it, and my body will just violently react the other way because I've gone from because it's caught up with my other
down.
It's the come down because I've had so many I might have had big feelings earlier in the week because I was stressed, and then I went from having all of those big stress feelings, completely blocking them through just bombarding myself with specialist interest for 2 days, feeling intense joy for 2 days, and then coming down from that, going from one to the other to nothing. It just my body just doesn't like that. I guess for me, the other thing that I've really liked about being a part of the tabletop gaming community is, for me, it's one of the few spaces where I feel like I can unmask and be my authentic self. And I think for me, there's really, because of that safety I've got from being a part of that community, I've really felt like, because I think a lot of the time for me, a lot of the reasons why I've masked and things is because, a lot of my life I was bullied at school and things, like to differing intensities and different ways of what that looked like. But I think for me, I always put up a bit of a block about my true feelings. I remember when I was a kid, if I was talking about a special interest, and other kids didn't like it, I could get really hurt by that. People would use that against me. So I think for me, after a while, as a kid, I just stopped talking about my special interest because I was like, it's a safety thing.
Yeah.
But then I could go into that space and be my authentic self again. Do you two have any experiences of that, or anything you want to discuss around masking? Is it the way that presents in you, or do you think masking presents differently for your different scenarios?
I think the thing that I have struggled most with late diagnosis is I don't know what my authentic self
That's what I was literally
looks
just
like.
about to say the same thing. I don't know what it looks like.
I don't know what that is. I'm aware that I shapeshift, and I'm aware that I chameleon, and sometimes, and I don't know if this is controversial or not, but sometimes I'm relieved to mask because sometimes I just want to be like everyone else and to be perceived like everyone else. And I will go back to that comfort mask of like, I just don't want to be the different one or the odd one out picked on. What's really interesting is, so I was diagnosed dyslexic when I was 10 years old, and they did quite an extensive report, and I was reading that report recently, and I sat down with my stepdad, who worked in special education English, so he'd seen a lot of those, and he was able to kind of break down the report for me. And he was like, the most interesting thing that has come out of this report is how successful you are at hiding your struggles. And he was saying that all of the things on paper, I was fine. And I was just like going through life and everything was easy until you watched me and saw how much I was working behind the scenes to just appear that way. And like with my dentist as well, I go to like a specialised dentist because I'm not good with the dentist. And they sedate me even to just like brush my teeth because I struggle so hard with that. And my mum said, I didn't realise how much you were hiding and how much you were masking every single day until I saw you sedated and saw, because I was hooked up to a monitor, and she was like, your body was having severe panic attacks and they weren't even like touching you at that point. She was like, that wall that you put up constantly, the sedation took away. And she was like, that's the first time I've really seen you really, really struggling because you hide it constantly. And we see that all the time in a lot of children will, like autistic children specifically, when they go to school, will try so hard and they'll go home and crash. So parents will be like, what do you mean they're great at school and they're doing all these things and they're eating all these things, and then they come home and, you know, they're having meltdowns and they're really struggling with their routine and they're not able to eat? It's because they're trying so hard for those hours at school that when they're at home or when they're safe, that's when it all gets released. I know I mask. I know I do it. It's just about finding what is me. Is it my mask version? Is it my unmasked version? Is it somewhere in between? And I'm still on that journey, but we're getting there.
I mean, I think in terms of masking, I could probably approach it from a work perspective, because I haven't, before my role at Purple Goat, I was self-employed. And before that, I couldn't hold a job because I was autistic. The reason Purple Goat works for me is because disability is one of my special interests. And on a daily basis, I'm, like we were talking about before, I have to manage those massive feelings when I'm writing pitch decks and getting excited, because I often will go off on tangents and... Anyway, so I'm constantly like at work, even though I absolutely love my job and it's everything. It's a perfect, like if someone when I was born was like, what is Dana's job gonna be? It would be Purple Goat, like working with Purple Goat. I mean, it's a goat and it's disability, so like it's perfect. But even in an inclusive, safe space, I can't allow myself, or even really know what it looks like, to know how to function unmasked in the workplace. And I know that even though I love my job, since working at Purple Go, I've definitely seen an increase in kind of my meltdowns outside of work, because I'm trying to re-navigate that space. I mean, I'm fortunate enough that like my line manager, like Josie and Dom, like are very aware of my struggles, and you know, we've got access to work and we've got all the things in place. But the bottom line is that autism is still a disability, and I'm never going to function like other people. Even in a safe, inclusive space, the main barrier is myself, because I don't know what I need. I don't know how to communicate it. And like I said, I'm in a really fortunate position where, I've got a very caring line manager, shout out Josie and Dom, who will help me work out what that looks like for me. But in terms of masking, I think one thing that is really beneficial is the fact we're a remote agency. Because we were obviously remote, so you can recharge those social batteries, everything's quite flexible, you can have those honest and open conversations about disability. But often, even after meetings, I will come away and think, did I make eye contact? Oh my God, I didn't. When I was presenting, did I keep a monotone tone? And these are all the things that, like, if you're not autistic and you don't master, you wouldn't think about. You'd walk away and make yourself a cup of tea and wouldn't worry about it. I have to have a whole debrief in my head afterwards. So I'm like, did I say something inappropriate? But I wouldn't even really know what that looks like. Did I make eye contact even though it's on Zoom? Did I laugh at the right places? Did I smile at the right places? Did I laugh inappropriately? And that's like what masking looks like to me. It's those over-analyzations of those events and those conversations in the workplace.
And I think that's why I struggle with the social model of disability, because it is not just the environment that is disabling me. If I had every single accommodation in the world, I would still be disabled and I would still be autistic. And like, even literally in this environment, I'm so aware that we're being filmed, and I'm so aware that this is going to go out publicly and people are going to have to make a judgment of me, because you could say people don't judge, but people make assumptions. That is how people work. There's always going to be an awareness, because like you said, it could be the most inclusive space, but it's going to go further. So you're going to work with non-disabled clients, and it's going to go to non-disabled or non-autistic or even autistic people with different experiences to you, because you know, you can still be disabled and ableist, because society is ableist and it's deep-rooted and it's ingrained and it's unpicking those things. But every time I'm not talking currently, I'm going, I shouldn't have said that.
Yeah, everything I just said, I'm like calm, I'm going to have to cut that out.
I know, I'm just like, so we're all going to see the edit and we're just going to cut it, because it's almost like we have been told our whole lives that everything we are doing is wrong. If you're told that every single day, you really take that on. And so I'm so aware. I've been asked to do so many TV shows and I'm like, no, because I know I know that A, I'll be constantly anxious, B, I'll be so aware of what I'm doing with myself, and C, because I know that there's going to be a huge amount of people who do not like me for being me. We've seen the amount of research when people are faced with autistic people, they are considerably more disliked than non-autistic people. So it's fact. We know that autistic people are not as liked, and I'm so aware of that. And I was like, I don't think I have the resilience or the brain power to read about myself because I'm already thinking it.
We were talking before. I think it's been termed like palatable versions
Yes.
of autism, and like recognizing that. I think a lot of the time, particularly in the autism space, you might be able to put this more eloquently than what I can. When we're talking about inclusive campaigns or working with like the autistic community, you can't exclude those with higher support needs. Because they are equally a part of our community. And I think sometimes it can kind of be a little bit of a battle between those who kind of can advocate for themselves, like I would say myself, kind of, and you know, and then it's kind of like, it's all kind of building. I mean, I don't know, because with your masters and stuff, you have like a better insight on that than how I just described it.
Well, I think it's because I work with a whole range of autistic people. I work with high to low and anywhere on that scale autistic people, and it's okay wherever you fall. You are just as valid, and your experience is just as valid. I think it's difficult again when you are someone with lower support needs who has felt like you have been told that you are not as valid because you present differently. It's creating this huge space, and people, I don't even think are doing it on purpose. It is just happening that so many higher support or non-verbal or using different communication aids autistic people, especially non-white autistic people, are being left out of these conversations and being left out of media and representation. It's difficult because I want to do everything, but I'm also so aware that I don't want to speak over people, and I want to be able to lift up people's voices. There's a gap in experiences, and we talked a bit about it in the research, but in the representation of media as well. There's a gap, there's a divide. I think people are so worried that because they've been think you're okay all the time, when you're like, I'm struggling, I want you to recognize that I'm struggling. That feeling sometimes can present as I'm struggling harder than you, and I don't think that's ever what people intend to do, but it sometimes can come across that way, and it's tricky.
I think as well, like when we're talking about like support needs, having a diagnosis of autism, you put it better before about, obviously, to have a diagnosis of autism, you struggle. It is a disability.
Yeah.
But when we're talking about support needs, it's unique to the person, or like, you know, you put it better before. I just keep diverting to Ruby. I should just be like, Ruby, she knows what I'm trying to say.
Because, well, I was just going to say the one thing, before you wrap up, the one thing I always say to people, and it's said but people don't register it, is if you have met one autistic person, you have met one autistic person. You see it everywhere, but people don't take it in, and that's what I want the takeaway to be. Every single autistic person's experience is going to be different. Every single autistic person's experience is valid.
It's been reflected somewhat in this panel today, the way we've discussed the differences in which autism presents to all three of us. But then we've also touched on this idea as well that this is a very small conversation between three people.
Yeah.
And there are so many voices that have not been heard today in society and everywhere, really. That's it as well. That, building on what you said, Ruby, it really is that takeaway of we need to expand this conversation and have it wider, and we need to have more voices involved, more lived experience, and more authenticity is the word I would use to sum it all up. Thank you everyone for listening or watching if you are watching this on YouTube. It's been a really excellent discussion, I think, between the three of us. Ruby, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Amazing, like, you had some amazing things to say there, and it quite resonated with me, and I'm sure Dana would agree as well.
Yes.
Until next time, thank you very much for listening or watching, and we will see you next time. Bye.